She offered herself for shelter from the snow. The giant mountain man said, "You don't owe me that," then drew her closer to himself. The storm came faster than Clara Weston expected. By the time she realized she'd lost the trail, the world had already turned white. Sky, earth, and horizon blending into a single blur of cold. The wind howled through the pines like something alive. Clawing at her dress and biting through the thin shawl, she clutched around her shoulders. She had been walking for hours, maybe more. Time didn't matter anymore. Her legs felt heavy, her lips numb, her heartbeat echoing in her ears louder than the storm itself. Every breath burned like ice. She had left everything behind that morning. The town of Miller's Creek, the people who whispered about her, the man who'd taken everything she owned and still told her was her fault. All she wanted was to reach the next town, find work, and start over. But the storm had other plans. Her boots sank into drifts that reached her knees. Her hands were stiff and red. She pressed them under her arms and forced herself forward, whispering to no one, "Just one more mile, Clara, just one more." But the snow didn't care. The cold crept up her spine, numbing thought and reason. When she finally stumbled against a tree trunk, she wasn't sure she could rise again. And then she saw it, a faint glow through the white curtain. A single, trembling light. She blinked through frozen lashes. Maybe it was a trick of her mind, the cruel kind that came before death. But when she squinted harder, the shape of a small cabin appeared through the trees, its chimney puffing thin smoke into the storm. Hope, sharp and sudden, burst through her chest. She used the last of her strength to move toward it. Her feet dragged, her vision blurred, and by the time she reached the steps, she could hardly lift her arm to knock. Her fist made a soft thud against a wooden door, once, twice, before her knees gave out. The door opened before she hit the ground. He stood there, a giant of a man, broad shoulders, hair thick and dark beneath a fur-lined collar, and eyes steady as mountain stone. The firelight behind him carved his shape in gold and shadow. For a long moment, neither spoke. The snow swirled between them. Then Clara's lips parted, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Please, I just need shelter. I'll do anything." The man's jaw tightened, not with anger but with something quieter, a kind of sadness. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped forward, his large hand catching her elbow before she could fall. His touch was rough from work, but careful in a way that made her eyes sting. "You don't need to offer me anything," he said simply. "Get inside before you freeze to death." He lifted her like she weighed no more than snow itself and carried her inside. The warmth hit her like a wave. The crackling of the fire, the smell of pine and smoke, the creak of wooden floors under his boots. He set her gently into a chair near the hearth, pulled a thick blanket from a hook, and wrapped it around her shoulders. The heat made her shiver all over again, her body trying to remember what warmth felt like. She looked around the cabin through half-blurred vision. It was small but strong, built by hands that knew both loneliness and endurance. Tools hung neatly on the wall. A rifle rested by the door. Everything about the place spoke of a man who lived by quiet order. He poured steaming water into a tin cup and held out to her. "Drink slow," he murmured. "You've been out too long." Her fingers brushed his as she took it. The warmth spread through her palms, up her arms, into her chest. "I didn't mean to intrude," she whispered. "I thought I could reach the next town before dark. But the wind—" "Don't talk," he interrupted softly. "You're safe here. That's all that matters." He turned away, stoking the fire. His shadow stretched long across the log walls. Outside, the wind howled and battered the shutters. But in here, the world had gone still. Clara leaned back, eyes fluttering shut, the blanket clutched around her. She didn't even realize she'd fallen asleep until the last thing she heard was his low voice near the door, not to her, but to himself. "Rest easy, little one. The mountain won't take you tonight." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. The fire burned steady through the storm, and two strangers, one broken, one silent, shared the same fragile warmth that night. Morning came slow over the mountains. The storm had calmed, leaving the world buried in white silence. Snowdrifts leaned against the cabin walls, and icicles hung from the eaves like glass teeth. Inside, the fire still glowed, red coals breathing softly. Clara awoke beneath a blanket heavier and warmer than any she'd known. For a moment, she didn't remember where she was. The smell of smoke, the steady crackle of the hearth, the distant sound of a man moving about, it all felt like part of a dream. Then she saw him. He was by the table, back turned to her, pouring hot water from a kettle into a chip mug. His shoulders filled the space like a wall, a broad, solid shape wrapped in worn flannel. His dark hair was still damp from melted snow, and when he turned slightly, the light caught the edge of an old scar that ran along his jaw. Clara sat up quickly, clutching the blanket to her chest. The movement made him glance over his shoulder. "You're awake," he said simply. His voice was low, rough from disuse, but not unkind. "That's good." She nodded, unsure what to say. Her lips were still cracked from the cold. He walked over and handed her the mug. "Drink. It's just tea." The warmth seeped into her palms. She took a careful sip and let the heat fill her chest. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice hoarse. "I didn't think I'd make it through the night." He crouched by the fire, adding a few logs with slow precision. "Not many would have," he replied. "That storm was the worst this side of the ridge." She studied him quietly. There was something about the way he moved, steady, deliberate, as if every motion had been shaped by years of solitude. His cabin was simple but neat, the kind of order that comes from a man who spends long winters alone. "You live out here?" she asked softly. "I do," he said without turning. "Closest town's 2 days' ride. I keep to myself mostly." "You trap?" He nodded once. "Trap. Hunt. Fix what breaks." Clara's eyes wandered to the mantel. A woman's shawl hung there, faded, carefully folded. Beside it sat a small wooden carving of a horse and a rusted tin cup that looked untouched for years. Something about those items made her chest ache. "You got family?" she asked before she could stop herself. He was silent for a long moment. Then, softly, "Had." The word lingered in the air, final and heavy. She didn't ask again. He stood, brushing off his hands. "You're safe here, Miss Weston." She froze. "How do you know my name?" A ghost of a smile crossed his lips. "You talk in your sleep," he said. Kept saying, "Clara Weston, don't quit," over and over. Her face flushed with embarrassment. She lowered her eyes, clutching the mug. "I'm sorry. I must have been half delirious." "You were freezing," he said simply. No shame in wanting to live. He walked to a shelf, took down a small loaf of bread and a piece of smoked meat, and placed them on the table. "Eat. Then you can rest again if you need to. The storm's left the roads buried. No sense in leaving till it clears." Clara hesitated. "I don't have money. Not much, anyway. But I can work for my keep. Wash, cook, mend." He turned, meeting her eyes with quiet firmness. "You don't owe me anything." The words hung between them, warm and solid. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear them. "I'm not in the habit of charging folks for staying alive," he added, almost under his breath. Clara's eyes softened. "You don't even know who I am." "Don't need to." For a long time, neither spoke. The wind whispered against the walls. The fire popped inside. Finally, she looked toward the window. The world outside still white and endless. "I suppose I should thank you for saving me." "You can do that by eating," he said, half smiling. "Name's Eli, by the way. Eli Thorne." She repeated it quietly, almost to herself. Eli Thorne. The name fit him, strong, simple, with a weight of solitude behind it. As she ate, he sat near the window, sharpening a knife in long, even strokes. The rhythm of steel against stone filled the quiet. Clara watched him from a corner of her eye. There was something comforting in his stillness, the kind that came from a man at peace with silence. The storm outside began to fade into nothing more than soft falling flakes. The light through the window turned gold, and though she'd only known him a few hours, Clara Weston realized something she hadn't felt in a long time: safety. That night, as the fire burned low, she watched him place another log on the coals before sitting back in his chair. His eyes caught the light, gray and thoughtful. He looked at her for a moment, then said quietly, "You can sleep easy tonight. The mountain's quiet now." And for the first time since she'd left town, Clara Weston believed she might survive this winter after all. The storm had brought her to his door, but something deeper, something older, had made him open it. By the third day, the storm had lifted completely. The sky turned from dull gray to a soft, washed-out blue, and sunlight glistened on the snow like a field of diamonds. The world outside was quiet, too quiet, as if even the mountains were holding their breath after the fury of the storm. Inside the cabin, the silence was softer, peaceful. Clara moved carefully, still uncertain of her place there. Her strength had returned, though her heart still felt heavy, like something fragile that might crack if handled wrong. Eli was outside, chopping wood. Each thud of the axe echoed to the still air, steady and sure, like the beating of a heart that never hurried, never faltered. Clara watched him through the frosted window. The man was built like the land itself, tall, broad, unyielding. Yet there was grace in his movements, a kind of quiet patience. She'd seen men who worked for show before, men who wanted the world to know their strength. Eli Thorne wasn't one of them. He worked because it needed doing, and because the mountain didn't care for pride. When he came back in, snow dusted his hair and shoulders. He set the axe by the door and gave her a small nod. "Firewood will last us a good while now." She smiled faintly. "You mean I've barely been any help." "You will be," he said simply. That quiet faith in his voice caught her off guard. No one had said words like that to her in a long time. She helped him with supper that evening, trying to keep busy. The smell of stew filled the cabin, venison, herbs, and a hint of smoke. It almost felt like a home. But as she moved around the room, something began to tug at her attention. There were small things she hadn't noticed before. A knitted shawl draped over a chair by the fire. A pair of boots, smaller than Eli's, tucked neatly near the wall. A single braid of dried flowers hanging above the mantel. Each one told a story she hadn't been invited to hear. When she reached up to touch the shawl, her fingers paused halfway. It was clean, folded, but not forgotten. The kind of thing someone kept near because they couldn't let go. Eli's voice came from behind her. "That was my wife's." She froze. Slowly, she turned. He stood by the table, hands resting on the back of a chair. His eyes didn't meet hers. "She passed last winter," he continued, voice low, heavy with something that never quite healed. "Fever took her quick. I buried her behind the pines." Clara's throat tightened. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He nodded once. "Wasn't your doing." The silence that followed was deep, not awkward, but filled with the weight of understanding. Two people who'd lost too much, each carrying a grief that didn't have words. She set the shawl down gently. "You must miss her." Eli's jaw flexed, his eyes still fixed on the fire. "Every day. But missing don't change much. Out here, the mountain don't stop for sorrow." His tone was simple, but his eyes betrayed him, eyes that had seen too many winters and too many graves. Clara hesitated, then spoke softly. "I lost someone too. My father, the year before last. He always said the mountain gives only what you respect. I suppose that's true of life too." For the first time, Eli looked at her, really looked. His gaze was steady, quiet, but not cold. "You talk like someone who's been hurt bad," he said. She gave a small, sad smile. "A woman don't end up lost in a snowstorm for nothing." That night, neither spoke much. They sat near the fire, the space between them warm but weighted with the ghosts of old memories. Eli worked on mending a leather strap, his big hands moving carefully with the needle. Clara watched the flames dance in the hearth, thinking about the woman whose shawl still held a faint trace of lavender. And for a strange, aching moment, she felt like an intruder in another woman's life, sitting where she once sat, speaking to man she once loved, breathing the air she once filled. But when Eli glanced up and met her eyes, the heaviness eased just a little. He gave her a small nod, wordless, but real, and she understood. This house might still belong to the past, but it was slowly learning to make room for the living again. As the fire burned lower, Eli spoke, almost as if to himself. Sometimes I think the snow brings people for a reason. Like it don't want anyone dying out there alone. Clara smiled faintly, eyes soft with tears she didn't let fall. Maybe it doesn't. The wind outside sighed through the trees, but inside the little cabin, the silence was no longer empty. It was shared. The snow softened as days turned into a quiet rhythm. The storm had long passed, but the world outside still lay blanketed in white, calm, endless, and waiting for spring. Inside the cabin, Clara had found a kind of peace she hadn't known she was looking for. Every morning, Eli would rise before dawn, stir the fire, and step out into the cold. She would hear the steady crunch of his boots fade into the forest. When he returned hours later, there would be game over his shoulder or would bundled under his arm and his face dusted with frost. He never said much, and yet the silence between them no longer felt sharp. It was steady, like the sound of the wind through the trees. Clara began to help where she could. She mended torn shirts with uneven stitches, swept the floor, learned how to snare rabbits and patch leather. Eli never told her what to do. He just let her find her way, and slowly she did. One morning, she stood at the table, slicing potatoes for stew, when she caught him watching her from the corner of the room. He wasn't staring, not in the way men often did, but quietly observing, as if surprised to see someone moving in his space again. "What?" she asked, half smiling. "Do I look that out of place?" He shrugged slightly. "Just haven't heard another voice in this cabin for near a year. Feels strange. Strange good or strange bad?" He gave a small, thoughtful pause. Still deciding, she laughed, a soft sound that startled even her. He looked up then, a faint grin tugging at his beard. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to a smile on his face, and it warmed the room more than the fire did. That afternoon, while he was outside repairing a fence, Clara wandered to the mantel again. The locket she'd found days ago sat there beside the wooden carving of a horse. Curiosity pulled at her. She hesitated, then picked it up. The locket was old, brass dull with age. Inside was a small portrait of a woman with gentle eyes, her hair swept back, her smile soft and sure. On the other side was a pressed flower, brittle, faded, but carefully preserved. Clara's chest tightened. She could almost feel the love that had lived here once, and the ache that had followed it. She was still holding it when Eli came back in. He stopped in the doorway, snow still clinging to his boots, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't be going through another person's things," he said quietly. She turned, guilt flushing her cheeks. I just saw it sitting here. I didn't mean to pry." He stepped closer, took the locket gently from her hand, and set it back in its place. For a long moment, the only sound was the fire's crackle. Then, softer this time, he spoke. "Her name was Mara. My wife. We were married 7 years. Clara said nothing. She just listened. His voice carried that slow, gravelly weight of a man who hadn't spoken her name in a long time. "She took sick when the fever came through the valley. I rode 3 days for a doctor. Came back too late. His eyes stayed on the fire, not on her. I buried her behind the pines. Couldn't leave after that. Place felt wrong without her, but I couldn't go anywhere else." Clara swallowed hard. "I'm sorry. I know what it's like to lose someone you love." He glanced at her then, brow furrowed. "You do?" She nodded slowly. "My father. The fever took him too. He was all I had. After that, I tried to make it on my own, but, well, the world's not too kind to women alone." A long silence followed. Then Eli murmured, "No, it ain't." Something passed between them. Quiet understanding, heavy but not hopeless. That evening, the wind picked up again, whispering against the shutters. Eli sat by the fire, whittling a piece of wood, while Clara mended a tear in her dress. After a while, she said softly, "You know, you could have turned me away that night." He didn't look up. "Didn't cross my mind. Most men wouldn't have done what you did. Most men ain't me." His tone was simple, not proud. She smiled faintly. "You say that like it's a bad thing." He set the carving down, a small bird now taking shape in his hands, and met her gaze. "You offered yourself for shelter. You thought that was the only way to earn a night out of the snow. Her breath caught. Yes. You don't owe me that, Clara, he said firmly, voice low but steady. You never did. The mountain's cruel enough without men adding to it. Tears stung her eyes, not from shame, but from the weight of being seen, perhaps for the first time in years. She nodded slowly. Thank you for not being like the others. He gave a small, quiet smile. Don't thank me yet. You haven't seen me mad. She laughed, the sound lighting up the cabin like firelight. He chuckled softly, too, a rough, unfamiliar sound, as though laughter ever gotten its way out of him. That night, when they both turned in, sleep came easier. The snow outside had stopped falling, and the sky stretched clear and full of stars. Clara lay awake a long while, watching the flicker of the dying fire. In that orange glow, Eli's silhouette sat slumped in his chair, chin on his chest, dozing. He looked gentler in sleep, and something deep within her stirred, something small and quiet, like a spark beneath ash. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was a beginning of belonging. The days had grown short again. A new storm was moving down from the ridge, the kind that could swallow sound and sight and sense all at once. By late afternoon, the wind was howling through the trees, bending the tall pines till they creaked like old bones. The sky bruised purple, then gray, then black. Snow began to fall in fierce, slanted waves. Eli worked outside until the last possible moment, tying shutters, reinforcing the roofline, bringing in wood. Clara watched from the window, her heart thudding with worry. When he finally came back in, he was white with snow, breath steaming like smoke. She rushed to help him shake off his coat, his hair damp, beard flecked with ice. You'll freeze out there, she said, her voice softer than she meant it to be. He gave a small grunt. Wouldn't be the first time. Still, he didn't pull away when her hands brushed his arms. Her touch was hesitant. Light as falling snow, but it lingered just long enough to leave warmth behind. He hung his coat by the fire, eyes meeting hers for a flicker of a moment too long. Outside, the storm roared. Inside, the world was firelight and shadows, and something between them that neither dared name. By nightfall, the wind was worse. It rattled the door, whistled through the gaps, and moaned down the chimney. The fire fought to hold its ground, throwing orange against the log walls. Clara sat wrapped in a blanket on the cot, trying to read by the flicker of the flame. But her fingers were numb, and her breath fogged in the air. Eli noticed. He was sitting at the table, sharpening a blade, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone. But when he saw her shiver, he set it down. You're cold. I'm fine, she lied, teeth almost chattering. He studied her for a long second, then stood. His steps were heavy on the wood floor. He took a thick quill from the trunk near the fire and walked over. Here, he said simply, draping it over her shoulders. You'll need it more than I do, she murmured. I've had worse nights, he replied. He turned to walk back to his chair, but she caught his sleeve without thinking. Her hand stayed there, fingers trembling against his rough flannel. Stay, she whispered. He froze. The storm outside wailed like some wild thing, and for a moment the silence between them was louder still. Clara! His voice was low, careful. Just, she swallowed, eyes bright with unshed tears. I don't want to be alone tonight. Her words broke something in him. Not pity, something older, deeper, like a gate opening on ground he kept locked away. He sat down beside her, the cot dipping under his weight. The warmth of him reached her before his hands did. That quiet, steady warmth that came from a man who'd lived through winters harsher than this one. For a long while they said nothing. The fire popped. The wind screamed. And in that small cabin, time slowed to the sound of their breathing. Then, softly, she said, I've never met anyone like you, Eli. He gave a half-smile, eyes on the fire. That's a good thing or a bad one. It's something I can't quite name. She shifted, the blanket slipping from her shoulder. He reached up instinctively, pulling it back over her. But his hand lingered, fingertips brushing the side of her neck. Her pulse quickened. He felt it. Their eyes met. For a heartbeat. Everything outside, the storm, the cold, the years they both lost, seemed to fade. Then she whispered, barely audible, "You don't have to keep pretending you don't care." He drew a slow breath, his voice a low rumble. "Clara, I care more than I should." "Then why?" "Because I've lost enough to know what it costs." His words hung heavy in the air, honest and raw. But she didn't pull away. She just looked at him, tears glinting in the firelight. "You don't owe me anything," he said again, softer this time. "Not your body, not your promise, not your past. You understand?" She nodded, but her voice shook. "And if I still want to stay close?" He hesitated. The kind of hesitation that happens right before a man lets his heart speak. Then finally he reached out. Slowly, carefully, he drew her toward him until her head rested against his chest. The sound of his heartbeat was steady and sure, like the rhythm of the mountain itself. "Then you stay," he murmured, his chin brushing her hair. "You stay as long as you need." She closed her eyes, her tears soaking into his shirt. The fire crackled low. The storm battered the walls. But for the first time in years, neither of them felt the cold. That night, no words were needed. He held her close, not as a man taking what was offered, but as one giving back warmth to a heart that had almost forgotten how it felt. Outside, the storm howled on. Inside, the giant mountain man and the lost woman found something stronger than shelter. They found peace. The storm passed some time before dawn. When Clara woke, the cabin was still and soft, lit by a pale wash of morning light, seeping to the frost-covered window. Eli was still beside her, sitting half upright against the wall, arms folded around like a man afraid to move, afraid the moment might shatter. For a long while, she didn't stir. She just listened to his slow breathing, to the steady thump of his heart beneath her ear. It was a sound that had kept her alive through the coldest night she'd ever known. The fire had burned down to embers, but there was a different kind of warmth in the air now. Quiet, steady, human. When he finally spoke, his voice was husky, low, like gravel stirred by wind. "You sleep any?" She smiled faintly against his chest. "Some." "Good. You needed it." He started to shift, careful not to wake her fully, but she caught his shirt and whispered, "Don't go yet." He froze, then sank back down, sighing softly. "You ain't used to someone staying, are you?" She shook her head, her voice almost a whisper. "No, folks always leave, or make you wish they would." He nodded, eyes on the window, where sunlight sparkled on snowdrifts like crushed glass. "Out here, leaving's easy," he said. "Staying, that's the hard part." She lifted her head, studying him. This man carved from mountain stone, but gentler than he'd ever admit. "Then maybe I'll stay," she said quietly. He met her gaze, those blue-gray eyes softening, like thawing ice. "You don't make promises when the snow's still deep," he murmured. "Wait till spring. If you still mean it, then we'll talk." She smiled. "All right, Eli. Spring, then." The days that followed slipped into a rhythm again, but something had changed. The silences were different now, not empty but full of understanding. She cooked, humming softly as she stirred the pot. He split wood, his axe rising and falling in an even rhythm. Sometimes he'd glance up to find her watching from the window, and she'd look away quickly, cheeks flushed from more than the fire. One evening, she found a new carving on the mantel beside the others, a small bird, wings open, feathers fine and careful. "You made this?" she asked. "Seemed right," he said, not looking at her. "You remind me of that little thing. Looks fragile, but it flew through a storm." She touched the carving gently, her throat tightening. "You notice more than you let on." He gave a half-smile. "I live quiet. Makes a man pay attention." As the weeks went on, the snow began to ease its grip. Tiny buds pushed through the white crust, and water trickled down from the hills. The air grew softer, the light longer. They started venturing out together, checking traps, gathering kindling, walking down to the frozen creek. She laughed once, slipping on the ice, and he caught her by the arm, strong, sure, steady. For a heartbeat, their eyes met again, close enough to feel each other's breath. "I told you," he said with a faint grin. "These mountains bite." Then it's a good thing I've got a guide, she said, smiling up at him. Something passed between them again, quiet but certain. The kind of thing you don't rush. The kind of love that grows like spring grass, patient, rooted, real. That night, as the stars came out over the ridge, Clara stood at the doorway, watching the sky. Eli joined her, the faint scent of pine and smoke clinging to him. You ever think about leaving? She asked softly. Sometimes, he admitted. Then I remember there's nothing out there worth what's here. What is here? She asked, testing the words. He turned to her, eyes warm in the moonlight. Peace. And maybe something more if we let it be. Her breath caught. She didn't answer, but her hand brushed his, just enough to let him know she understood. The night wind sighed through the trees. The mountain stood silent, eternal. And in the hush between them, something beautiful took root. Not passion, not promise, but something purer. Belonging. By the time the mountains softened into spring, the cabin no longer felt like a refuge. It felt like home. The drift had melted into running creeks. The trees stood heavy with buds, and the first meadowlarks were singing again. Clara had shed the look of a lost traveler. Her cheeks were warm with color, her hair bright in the sun. She laughed easily now, a sound Eli never knew he'd missed until it filled his cabin. He still said little, but his silence had changed. It was no longer a wall. It was comfort, a space they shared. And often, when she hummed to herself while cooking, he'd pause his work, just listening. The kind of quiet that said more than words ever could. One afternoon, she was outside hanging laundry, her bare feet sinking into damp earth, when she saw two riders coming up the trail. They were strangers, hard men with sharp eyes, one of them carrying a rifle strapped across his back. Her stomach twisted. Eli stepped out of the barn as they reined in. His body went still, hand hovering near his belt, but never reaching for the gun. "You Eli Cutter?" one of them called. Eli's voice was steady. "Depends who's asking. We're looking for a woman, mid-20s. Name's Clara Ward. Been missing since December. Her uncle's offering a reward." Clara froze behind the clothesline, her heart slamming against her ribs. Eli's eyes flicked to her, just for a breath, before turning back to the men. "Ain't seen no one like that," he said, calmly. The men studied him a moment longer. Then one spat into the dirt. "If you do, tell her running don't erase debts. Folks in town don't forget." They turned their horses and rode off, the sound of hooves fading down the valley. Clara stayed rooted in place, trembling. Eli walked toward her slowly. "They gone," he said quietly. She nodded, tears brimming. "I didn't mean to bring trouble to your door." "You didn't," he said, "but you best tell me the truth now." Inside, she sat by the fire, the same place she had that first night, and told him everything. About her uncle's debt, the man he'd tried to sell her to, about running through the snow until her boots split, about how she thought freezing to death was better than the life waiting for her. Eli listened without interrupting, his jaw tight, his eyes dark with something between fury and sorrow. When she finished, her voice was barely a whisper. "If they find me, they'll drag me back. I can't go, Eli. I can't." He rose then, pacing the floor, the boards creaking under his boots. When he spoke, his voice was low but steady. "Ain't nobody taking you anywhere you don't want to go. They'll come back. Then they'll learn these mountains don't give up what they shelter." She looked up at him, this giant of a man who'd lived alone in grief and silence, now standing like a wall between her and the world. "Why would you do that for me?" she asked softly. He turned to her, his voice rough with truth. "Because you walked into my storm and brought the quiet back with you." The words hung in the air, simple, unpolished, but real. Days passed, and no one returned. The danger faded like snowmelt in sunlight. But something had changed between them. Not just safety, not just gratitude. Love, in its truest form, steady, earned, alive, had taken root. Eli didn't say it. He wasn't the kind of man who needed to. But every time he filled her cup before his own, every time he fixed her door latch or left firewood stacked high by morning, she felt it. And one evening, as the last light slipped across the mountains, she walked to him where he was sitting on the porch, carving in silence. "You were right," she said softly. "Snow's gone, and I still mean it." He looked up, confused. "Mean what?" She smiled, eyes glistening. "That I'll stay." Eli set the carving down. His voice, when it came, was low and unsteady. "You sure, Clara? You know what life's like up here. It's quiet, hard, long." She stepped closer, her hand finding his. "It's life, and it's ours if you'll have me." For a moment, neither moved. The wind carried the scent of pine and thawing earth. A bird sang in the distance. Then he reached out, pulling her gently into his arms, the same arms that had once been her shelter from the storm. "You don't owe me that," he murmured. She smiled against his chest. "I know. That's why it means something." He let out a slow, deep breath, the kind that feels like letting go of years. Then he held her tighter, his chin resting against her hair. Outside, the mountain breathed with them. The storm had ended long ago, and in its place, where snow once buried everything, love finally bloomed.